Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory and you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page, which is just basically a cozy corner of the internet for narrative. And here on Tuesday nights we read old folklore and fairy tales with a little bit of sound effects, works as a background, or if you want to read along with it, I'll have the words up next to my big white head. If you are not watching this live, though, down in the description below, there will be timestamps where you can jump ahead to the various stories. We're going to read two stories tonight. The first one is Irish from Yeats's collection, The Folklore and Fairy Tales of the Irish Peasantry. Actually, I think this one is just for the fairy tales. They are technically two works. I know it says by Croft and Croker there. That's, I assume, who collected it initially, but Yeats puts it together. Called The Young Piper. And then the second story that we're going to read comes from a fairly famous folklorist from France, Charles Perrault. And it is called, I just blanked on it, something Tuft. Oh, yeah, Riquet with the Tuft. And the theme that ties the two together is they're both just so mean to babies. And I don't mean like violent to babies, although there is some intonations of that. It never actually comes to anything. Instead, they're just really insulting to babies and people in general for not being pretty enough or something. And the thing is the stories try to develop morals out of it, but I feel like by the time if you were a person who was considered non-traditional in your looks, and you were reading this story, it would not be reassuring that the ending was like, and that is why actually you're the best. GS is in the chat, says good evening. Can't wait to hear the ugly baby stories. When I was little, I had storybooks that had those line illustrations, and I used to find the baby drawings terrifying. I find that some people over-render the wrinkles that babies can have, especially when they're newborn, and so they just look like little gremlins. I should say, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I should say this first story that we're going to read tonight, it hints towards the idea that the baby is from the good people. And I'll remind you, if you don't want to hear any of this framing, down in the description below, if you're not watching it live, there will be timestamps. You can just jump right ahead and skip all this. But there's intonations that the baby was swapped by the good people, and that's a really common thing. We've seen that in stories before. It's really common in Irish folklore, but it does come up in other Celtic areas as well, and beyond Celtic areas, but it's really particularly focused there. Exactly where it comes from is debatable. There is a popular theory anyways, that what their descriptions of their child suddenly, being obviously possessed or obviously not their child or whatever, might just refer to certain neurodivergent conditions that can manifest as a child starts to age up a bit between 2 and 4. And therefore some of the things that they recommend are particularly cruel. But I will say this story doesn't actually have it. We did hear a story once where they put a hole in someone's mouth, a baby's mouth, and then it admits who it is and whatever else, which obviously is a psychotic thing to do. But, that's the thing about superstition. It can take you anywhere. But this story doesn't really follow that pattern. I chose two stories that just basically were quite insulting. And the thing that I think you need to keep in mind as we read the first story, The Young Piper, is it's probably based on somebody's actual child who definitely wasn't from the good people. Oh, and if you don't know, the good people is slang that is in use to this day for fairies or fae folk in general, leprechauns, solitary Irish spirits, things like that. The good people is again a largely Celtic term, but not specifically, not exclusively, for the people, the little people, the piskies, the things like that. So when they say it's from the good people, what they are basically saying is a trickster spirit has swapped in one of their own for your baby. So you'll raise it, and then it does what trickster spirits and fae do, which is just raise hell for the sake of raising hell. And the second tale is more explicitly a tale that's meant to be sort of a message about appearances over wit. But it is just bonkers. So if you enjoy an hour of storytelling, if you can stick with me that long, I think as long as you came here because you wanted to hear some babies get burned, metaphorically, then I think this stream will deliver. Okay. GS says, so if your baby didn't look like your husband, you blamed the fairies. Ah, now that's a good point. I haven't really heard that angle, but obviously that's a possibility, yeah. Now this first one, the Irish tale, opens in a quaint little town. So I'm going to knock down the music just a little bit. I'm going to take down the fireplace just a little bit. I'm going to give us a little bit of ambient birds and wind. And, you know, it's an agrarian society. I think there'll be some chickens and cows. And if any of those become too distracting, I'll turn them off. You can also let me know in the live chat. If you don't know, there's a live chat here. That's how I'm talking to GS. Feel free to join in. I really enjoy having a little crowd who gives some feedback. Not so much like criticism or whatever else. I just mean like your reactions to the tales. I always enjoy those. Our first story tonight comes from W.B. Yeats' collection, The Fairy Tales of Irish Peasantry, or Irish Fairy Tales, as I think it's often called. And it is a tale collected by Crofton Croker called The Young Piper. There lived not long since, on the borders of the county Tipperary, a decent, honest couple whose names were Mick Flanagan and Judy Muldoon. These poor people were blessed, as the saying is, with 4 children, all boys. 3 of them were as fine, stout, healthy, good-looking children as ever the sun shone upon. And it was enough to make any Irishman proud of the breed of his countrymen to see them about 1 o'clock on a fine summer's day, standing at their father's cabin door with their beautiful flaxen hair hanging in curls about their head, and their cheeks like 2 rosy apples, and a big laughing potato smoking in their hand. A proud man was Mick of his fine children, and a proud woman, too, was Judy. And reason enough they had to be so. But it was far otherwise with the remaining one, which was, of course, the 3rd eldest. He was the most miserable, ugly, ill-conditioned brat that ever God put life into. He was so ill-thriven that he never was able to stand alone or to leave his cradle. He had long, shaggy, matted, curled, and as black as soot hair. His face was of a greenish-yellow color, and his eyes were like 2 burning coals, and they were forever moving in his head as if they had perpetual motion. Before he was a 12-month-old, he had a mouthful of great teeth. His hands were like kite's claws, and his legs were no thicker than the handle of a whip, and about as straight as a reaping hook. To make the matter worse, he had the appetite of a cormorant, and the whinge, and the yelp, and the screech, and the yell was never out of his mouth. The neighbors, well, they all suspected that he was something not right, particularly as it was observed when people, as they do in the country, got about the fire and began to talk of religion and good things. The brat, as he lay in the cradle nearby, which his mother generally put near the fireplace that he might be snug, he used to sit up, and as they were in the middle of their talking, and begin to bellow, as if the devil was in him in right earnest. And this, as I said, led the neighbors to think that all was not right with the young lad. And there was a general consultation held one day what would be best to do with him. Some advised, this is what I meant by intonating violence, some advised to put him out on the shovel. But Judy's pride was up at that. Her pride, is that what it was? Not just her general sense of care for a child? A pretty thing indeed, that a child of hers should be put on a shovel and flung out on the dunghill like a dead kitten or a poisoned rat. No, no, no! She would not hear that at all. One old woman, who was considered wise and very skillful and knowing in fairy matters, strongly recommended to her to put the tongs in the fire, heat them red hot, and to take his nose in them, and that would beyond all manner of doubt make him tell what he was and where he came from. So I need to pause because someone has just told you that a wise person told her to heat up tongs and burn her child's nose. And as I mentioned, this is a traditional thing in folklore, as you assume that this is fae and they're pulling a trick and it's like torturing them into talking. I certainly hope it never left folklore. I hope no one did this to their own child, but I'm not hopeful that that is true. Just so you know, this isn't just one weird thing from the story. This is a standard thing to do with your weird baby, apparently. For the general suspicion was that he'd been changed by the good people. But Judy was too soft-hearted and too fond of the little imp, so she would not give in to this plan. Good job, Judy. Though everybody said she was wrong, and maybe she was, but it's hard to blame a mother. Well, some advised one thing and some another. At last one spoke of sending for the priest. Can you imagine if it's just your child and they're like, that child's so ugly, you need to burn him or send for a priest, who was a very holy and very learned man, to see it. To this, Judy, of course, had no objection, but one thing or other always prevented her from doing so, and the upshot of the business was that the priest never saw him. Things went on in the old way for some time longer. The brat continued, yep, and yowling, and eating more than his 3 brothers put together, and playing all sorts of unlucky tricks, for he was mighty mischievously inclined, till it happened one day that Tim Carroll, the blind piper, going his rounds, called in and sat down by the fire to have a bit of chat with the woman of the house. Now just for a brief moment here, what do they mean by pipes here? They mean something called Julian pipes, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It is also not what they would have called them then. They are kind of like bagpipes. That's probably the closest. They're not bagpipes exactly. That are more common in Ireland. So think bagpipes. If you don't know the kind of pipes he actually would have had. So after some time, Tim Carroll, the blind piper with the pipes, who was no churl of his music, yoked on the pipes and began to bellows away in high style. And when the instant he began, the young fellow, who'd been lying as still as a mouse in his cradle, sat up and began to grin and twist his ugly face, to swing about his long, tawny arms, and to kick out his crooked legs, and to show signs of great glee at the music. At last nothing would serve him, but he should get the pipes... At last nothing would serve him, but he should get the pipes into his own hands. And to humor him, his mother asked him to lend them to the child for a minute. And Tim, who was kind to children, readily consented. But also, Tim was blind. He had no sight, and so he didn't really know what he was handing it to. the story wants you to know. Judy herself brought them to the cradle and went to put them on him, but she had no occasion, for the youth seemed quite up to the business. He buckled on the pipes and set the bellows under one arm and the bag under the other, and worked them both as knowingly as if he had been 20 years at the business, and lilted up Shilanagrea in the finest style imaginable. All were in astonishment. The poor woman crossed herself. Tim, who was, as I said before, dark, which I think means blind here, did not well know who was playing. He was just in great delight, and when he heard that the little Pichan, which is just an Irish word for child, not 5 years old, that had never seen a set of pipes in his life, he wished the mother joy of her son, offered to take him off her hands if she would part with him, swore he was a born piper, a natural genius, and declared that in a little time more, with the help of a little good instruction from himself, there would not be his match in the whole country. The poor woman was greatly delighted to hear all this, particularly as what Tim said about natural genius quieted some misgivings that were rising in her mind, lest what the neighbors said about his not being right might be too true. And it gratified her, moreover, that her dear child, for she really loved the whelp, would not be forced to turn out and beg, and might earn a decent bread for himself. So when Mick came home in the evening, her husband, from his work, she up and told him all that had happened, and all that Tim Carroll, the blind piper, had said, and Mick, as was natural, was very glad to hear it. For the helpless condition of the poor creature was a great trouble to him. So next day he took the pig to the fair, and with what it bought set off to Clonmel, and bespoke a brand new set of pipes of the proper size for him. I don't know who's making baby pipes. In about a fortnight the pipes came home. The moment the chap in his cradle laid eyes on them, he squealed with delight, and threw up his pretty legs, and bumped himself in his cradle, and went off with a great many comical tricks, till at last, to quiet him, they gave him the pipes, and he immediately set to pull away a jig potawk, to the admiration of all her heardom, for he was very good. The fame of his skill on pipes soon spread far and near, and for there was not a piper in the 6 next counties who could come at all near him. In old Modereroo, the hare and the corn, the fox hunter's jig, the rakes of Cashel, or the piper's maggot, or any other of the fine Irish jigs which make people dance whether they will or no, and it was surprising to hear him rattle away the fox hunt. You'd really think you'd heard the hounds giving tongue, and the terriers yip yip yelping always behind, and the huntsmen and the whippers in cheering or correcting the dogs. It was, in short, the very next thing to seeing the hunt itself. Well, the best of him was he was no ways stingy of his music, and the many a merry dance the boys and girls of the neighborhood used to have in his father's cabin, and he would play up music for them that they said used as it were to put quicksilver in their feet, and they all declared they never moved so light, so airy to any piper's playing that they'd ever danced to. Now, just as a note before we go on, being really good at music in many traditions of folklore is usually the sign that there is something uncanny about you. I think the most modern version is sell your soul to the devil at the crossroads. And that's how, a whole bunch of guitarists supposedly were so good with no training. It's just a thing that doesn't come up as much anymore, but knowing too much about music or really anything was always seen as like, do you have deals with the devil? Are you uncanny? Whatever else. But besides all his fine Irish music, he had one queer tune of his own, the oddest that was ever heard, and for the moment he began to play it, everything in the house seemed to disposed to dance. The plates, the porringers, used to jingle on the dresser. The pots and pot hooks used to rattle in the chimney. And people used to even fancy they felt the stools move from under them. But however it might be with the stools, it is certain that no one could keep long sitting on them, for both old and young always fell to capering as hard as ever they could. The girls complained that when he began this tune, it always threw them out in their dancing, and what they never could handle their feet rightly, for they felt the floor like ice under them and themselves every moment ready to come sprawling out on their backs or on their faces. The young bachelors who wished to show off their dancing and their new pumps and their bright red or green or yellow garters swore that it confused them so that they never could go rightly through the heel and toe or cover the buckle or any of their best steps, but felt themselves always all bedizzied and bewildered. And then old and young would go jostling and knocking together in a frightful manner, and when the unlucky brat had them all in his way, whirligigging about the floor, he'd grin and chuckle and chatter for all the world like Jacko the Monkey when he was played off some of his roguery. I did look up Jacko the Monkey. There was like 5 references to it, and I don't know exactly. None of them were contemporary to when this book was published, so they came well after, so I really don't know the source of it. The older he grew, the worse he grew, and by the time he was 6 years old, there was no standing the house for him. He was always making his brothers burn or scald themselves or break their shins over the pots and stools. One time in harvest, he was left at home by himself, and when his mother came in, she found the cat on a horseback, like the dog, with her face to the tail and with her legs tied round him, and the urchin playing his queer tune to them. And so that the dogs went barking and jumping about, and the puss was mewing for the dear life and slapping her tails backwards and forwards, which, as it would hit against the dog's chaps, he'd snap at it and bite. And then there was the fililoo. Another time, the farmer with whom Mick worked, a very decent and respectable man, happened to call in, and Judy wiped a stool with her apron and invited him to sit down and rest himself after his walk. And he was sitting with his back to the cradle, and behind him was a pan of blood, for Judy was making pig's pudding. Just in case you don't know, pudding could refer to a lot of things, but in this case it's maybe referring to sausages. The lad lay quite still in his nest, watched his opportunity till he got a hook at the end of a piece of twine, which he contrived to fling so handily that it caught on the knob of the man's nice new wig, and soused it in the pan of blood. Another time his mother was coming in from milking the cow with the pail on her head. Just to be clear, the full pail being supported on her head. Not upside down. The moment he saw her, he lilted up his infernal tune, and the poor woman had to let go of the pail and clap her hands aside and began to dance a jig. Tumbled the milk all atop of her husband, who was bringing in some turf to boil the supper. In short, there would be no end to telling all his pranks and all the mischievous tricks he played. Soon after, some mischances began to happen to the farmer's cattle. A horse took the staggers, a fine veal calf died of the black leg, of some of the sheep of the red water. The cows began to grow vicious, and to kick down the milk pails, and the roof of one end of the barn fell in, and the farmer took it into his head that Mick Flanagan's unlucky child was the cause of all the mischief. So one day he called Mick aside and said to him, "Mick, you see, things are not going with me as they ought to. And to be plain with you, Mick, I think that child of yours is the cause of it. I'm really falling away with nothing with fretting. And I can hardly sleep on my bed at night for thinking of who may happen before the morning, or what may happen before the morning. So I'd be glad if you'd look out for work somewhere else. You're as good a man as any in the country. There's no fear, but you'll have your choice of work." To this Mick replied that he was sorry for his losses, and still sorrier that he or his should be thought of to be the cause of him, and that of his own part he was not quite easy in his mind about the child, but he had him, and so he must keep him. What a thing to say. To be a father. If I ever happen to have a child, I'm going to be like, well, I had you, so I have to keep you. And he promised to look out for another place immediately. Accordingly, next Sunday at chapel, Mick gave out what he was about, leaving the work at John Reardon's. And immediately a farmer who lived a couple miles off and who wanted to a plowman, the last one having just left him, came up to Mick, offered him a house and garden, and work all year round. Mick, who knew him to be a good employer, immediately closed with him. And so it was agreed that the farmer should send a car. Just as a note, if you didn't know, this is not a reference to a motor vehicle. Car takes its etymology from cart. They used to just call carts cars, and then when cars came along, they served the purpose of carts, so they just started calling them cars. A car to take his little bit of furniture, and that he should remove on the following Thursday. And so when Thursday came, the car came according to promise, and Mick loaded it and put the cradle with the child and his pipes on top, and Judy sat beside it to take care of him lest he should tumble out and be killed. They drove the cow before them and the dog followed, but the cat was of course left behind. Don't know why. And the other 3 children went along the road to pick skihories and blackberries, and for it was a fine day towards the latter end of the harvest. Now, they had to cross a river, and if you know your folklore, I think you know that's going to be a problem. But as it ran through a bottom between 2 high banks, you did not see it till you were close on it. The young fellow was lying pretty quietly in the bottom of a cradle till they came to the head of the bridge. And when hearing the roaring water, for there was a great flood in the river, as it had rained heavily for the last 2 or 3 days, he sat up in his cradle and looked about him, and the instant he got sight of the water, found they were going to take him across it. Oh, how he did bellow, and how he did squeal! No rat caught in a snap trap ever sang out equal to him. "Whist and Lana," said Judy. "There's no fear of you. Sure, it's only over the stone bridge we're going." "Bad luck to you, you old rip," cried he. "What a pretty trick you've played me to bring me here." And still he went on yelling, and the farther they got on the bridge, the louder he yelled, till at last Mick could hold out no longer. So giving him a great scalp of the whip he had in his hand, "Devil choke you, you brat," said he. "Will you ever stop bawling? A body can't hear their ears for you." The moment he felt the throng of the whip, he leaped up in the cradle, clapped the pipes under his arm, and gave a most wicked grin at Mick, and jumped clean over the battlements of the bridge down into the water. "Oh, my child," shouted Judy. "He's gone forever from me." Mick and the rest of the children ran to the other side of the bridge, looking over, and they saw him coming out from under the arch of the bridge, sitting comfortably cross-legged on the top of a white-headed wave, and playing away on his pipes as merrily as if nothing had happened. The river was running, of course, very rapidly. So he was whirled away at a great rate, but he played as fast, aye, and faster than the river ran. And though they set off as hard as they could along the bank, as the river made a sudden turn round the hill about 100 yards below the bridge, by the time they got there, he was out of sight, and no one has ever laid eyes on him more. But the general opinion was that he went home with the pipes to his own relations, the good people, to make music for him. So in that story, I mean, it's basically stated that he is definitely of the good people. Oh, I see Janera's there. Hello, Janera. Thank you for watching. Janera says, "I'm late, but it sounds like a changeling story." Indeed. I don't even know if this one qualifies as a changeling story because it seems like the kid was always hideous. It's just a body swap in general. But it is along that genre of changeling story that is so popular in Irish folklore. Gia says the kid is starting to worry me. Indeed. I always like the cadence that Yeats gives his collections. It's obvious that he's gone over the prose. It has that polish. I'm gonna have a little drink of water because that is a mouthful of a story. Gia says the story was to cover the family dumping him in the river. Yeah. Honestly, probably, yeah. Like, not even as a joke. There's a lot of stories in folklore where you're like, this is just a cover for a murder or something like that. Like, yeah, I can think of a few examples. And as our German translator, Jürgen Hubert, says, very often it seems like stories just to cover why you came home late and drunk. Anyways, who cares? It's a good story. May we all tell a story so compelling, a lie so compelling, it becomes a multi-century folklore. Okay. Carrying on with my theme of just brutal insults to babies. This was the story that sort of kicked me off in the direction of doing this stream, because it did occur to me that when a folklore wants to be mean about looks, it's really mean about looks. Like yeah, that's right. Genera says, I didn't get drunk, I was kidnapped by fairies. Another popular one in German folklore is the pressure spirits, the ones that mount on your back and therefore slow you home, and then you have all these bruises on you. I remember when I was reading them, I was like, this could be two things. You got drunk and you got in a fight and you don't want to explain that because you're not supposed to be out. Or something else gave you those bruises, some maybe fair but frisky young woman, and you don't want to explain it. Okay. This one takes place in a castle, largely, although it moves around. And I'll say a bit on it, but let's get some ambiance. Our next story comes from Charles Perrault, who's almost certainly written something you read. I want to say 17th century, but I could be off on that. Writer who kind of did his own renditions of folklore. He sort of sells them as his originals, but we know enough about the genus of folklore in the region and stuff to know that basically he just kind of was doing what Yeats was doing, but not giving credit. There are obviously some original stuff from him. This is one that I've never actually heard before, and I may be alone in that, called Riquet with the Tuft. Charles Perrault, of course, is French, and I'm trying to think of his most famous tale. The name has slipped on my mind. I had it all prepped and everything. I should have written it down. It'll come back to me later. But you've definitely heard tales from Charles Perrault's collections. This one in particular tries to have the moral that looks aren't everything. I'm going to leave it up to chat and anybody lurking to decide if it in any way achieves that, because I don't think it does. So our final story tonight is Riquet with the Tuft, which comes from Charles Perrault, a classic old French folklorist and writer. Oh, clicked off it, sorry. There was once, upon a time, a queen who was brought to the bed of a son so hideously ugly that it was long disputed whether he even had human form. Just gonna let that line sit with you for a minute. A fairy who was at his birth affirmed he would be very lovable for all that ugliness, since he should be endowed with an abundance of wit. Now, before I move on here, in modern context, we almost only use wit for, like, comic, like the ability to make jokes, and that is included in this. But wit just means sort of a lot of things back in this time. Cleverness, intelligence, knowing a lot of little stories, good anecdotes, just being generally engaging and clever. She even added that it would be in his power, by virtue of a gift she had just given him, to bestow on the person he most loved as much wit as he pleased. All this somewhat comforted the poor queen, ugly baby, who was under a grievous affliction for having brought into the world such an ugly brat. Promise I'll get through this. It's so mean. It is true that this child no sooner began to prattle, but he said 1,000 pretty things, and that in all his actions there was something so taking that he charmed everybody. Now, I forgot to tell you that he came into the world with a little tuft of hair upon his head, which made them call him Riquet with the Tuft. For Riquet was the family name. 7 or 8 years after this, the queen of a neighboring kingdom was delivered of 2 daughters at birth. The firstborn was beautiful beyond compare, whereat the queen was so very glad that those present were afraid that her excess of joy would do her harm. The same fairy who had assisted at the birth of little Riquet with the Tuft was here also, and to moderate the queen's gladness, she declared that this little princess should have no wit at all, but be as stupid as she was pretty. This mortified the queen extremely, but some moments afterwards she had far greater sorrow, for the second daughter she was delivered of was very ugly. "Do not afflict yourself so much, madame," said the fairy. "Your daughter shall have so great a portion of wit that her want of beauty will scarcely be perceived." "God grant it," replied the queen, "but is there no way to make the eldest, who is so pretty, have some little wit?" "I can do nothing for her, ma'am, as to wit," answered the fairy, "but everything else as to beauty, and as there is nothing but what I would do for your satisfaction, I give her for gift, and that she shall have the power to make handsome the person who she best pleases her, who shall best please her." And as these princesses grew up, their perfections grew up with them. All the public talk was of the beauty of the eldest and the wit of the youngest. It is also true that their defects increased considerably with their age. The youngest visibly grew uglier, and the eldest became every day more and more stupid. She either made no answer at all to what was asked her, or said something very silly. She was with all this so unhandy that she could not place 4 pieces of china upon the mantelpiece without breaking one of them, nor drink a glass of water without spilling half of it upon her clothes. Though beauty is a very great advantage in young people, yet here the youngest sister bore away the bell almost always in all company from the eldest. People would indeed go first to beauty to look upon and admire her, but turn aside soon after to the wit, to hear 1,000 most entertaining and agreeable turns, And it was amazing to see, in less than a quarter of an hour's time, the eldest with not a soul with her, and the whole company crowding about the youngest. The eldest, though she was unaccountably dull, could not but notice it, and would have given all her beauty to have half the wit of her sister. The queen, prudent as she was, could not help reproaching her several times, which had like to have made this poor princess die for grief. Well, one day she retired into the woods to bewail her misfortune, and she saw coming to her a little man, very disagreeable, but most magnificently dressed. This was, of course, the young Prince Riquet with the tuft, who, having fallen in love with her by seeing her picture, many of which went all over the world, had left his father's kingdom to have the pleasure of seeing and talking with her. Overjoyed to find her thus all alone, he addressed himself to her with all imaginable politeness and respect, having observed, after he had made her the ordinary compliments, that she was very melancholy. "I cannot comprehend, madame, how a person so beautiful as you are can be so sorrowful as you seem to be. For though I can boast of having seen infinite numbers of ladies exquisitely charming, I can say that I never beheld anyone whose beauty approaches yours." "You are pleased to say so," answered the princess, and here she stopped, because she has no wit. "Beauty," replied Riquet the Tuft, "is such a great advantage, that it ought to take the place of all things. Since you possess this treasure, I see nothing that can possibly very much afflict you." Which, he's supposed to be the smart one. What a dumb thing to say. Being pretty doesn't make you happy. "I had far rather," cried the princess, "be..." I'll get this out. Give me a second. "I had far rather," cried the princess, "be as ugly as you are, and have wit, than have the beauty I possess and be so stupid as I am." "There is nothing, madame," returned he, "shows more than what we have wit than to believe we have none. And it is the nature of that excellent quality that the more people have of it, the more they believe they want it." "I do not know that," said the princess, "but I know very well that I am very senseless, and thence proceeds the vexations which almost kills me." "If that be all, madame, which troubles you, I can very easily put an end to your affliction." "And how will you do that?" cried the princess. "I have the power, madame," replied Riquet with the Tuft, "to give to that person whom I shall love best so much wit as can be had. And as you, madame, are that very person, it will be your fault only if you have not as great a share of it as anyone living, and provided you will be pleased to marry me." Well, the princess remained quite astonished, and answered not a word. And there's a very pretty picture that you see tiny versions of. But this book is on Gutenberg for free, called The Fairy Tales of Charles Perrault. I do recommend it if you want to see that closer. "I see," replied Riquet with the Tuft, "that this proposal makes you very uneasy. And I do not wonder at that, but I will give you a whole year to consider of it." While the princess had so little wit, and at the same time so great a longing to have some, that she imagined the end of that year would never come. Therefore she accepted the proposal which was made her. She had no sooner promised Riquet the Tuft that she would marry him on that day 12-month, than she found herself quite otherwise than she was before. She had suddenly an incredible facility of speaking whatever she pleased, after a polite, easy, and natural manner. She began that moment A very gallant conversation with Riquet with the Tuft, wherein she tattled at such a rate that Riquet with the Tuft believed he had given her more wit than she had reserved for himself. And when she returned to the palace, the whole court knew not what to think of such a sudden and extraordinary change, for they had heard from her now as much sensible discourse as many infinitely witty turns, as they had stupid and silly impertinences before. I'm not going to do better than that. The whole court was overjoyed at it beyond imagination. It pleased all but her younger sister, because having no longer the advantage of her in the respect of wit, she appeared, in comparison of her, a very disagreeable and homely puss. The king governed himself by her advice and would even sometimes hold council in her apartment. Well, the noise of this change spreading everywhere, all the young princes of the neighboring kingdoms strove all they could to gain her favor, and almost all of them asked her in marriage, but she found not one of them had wit enough for her, and she gave them all a hearing, but would not engage herself to any. However, there came one so powerful, rich, witty, and handsome that she could not help having a good inclination for him. Her father perceived it, and told her that she was her own mistress as to the choice of a husband, and that she might declare her intentions. Pardon me. Just drinking some water. As the more wit we have, the greater difficulty we find to make a firm resolution upon such affairs. Truer things never spoken. This made her desire her father, after having thanked him, to give her more time to consider of it. She went accidentally to walk in the same wood where she had originally met Riquet with the Tuft, to think, the more conveniently, what she ought to do. While she was walking in a profound meditation with her ample wits, she heard a confused noise under her feet. As if it were many great people who went backwards and forwards and were very busy. Having listened more attentively, she heard one say, "Bring me that pot! And another, give me that kettle. And a third, put some wood upon the fire." The ground at the same time opened, and she seemingly saw under her feet a great kitchen full of cooks, scullions, and all sorts of servants necessary for a magnificent entertainment. There came out of it a company of roasters, to the number of 20 or 30, who went to plant themselves in a fine alley of wood, about a very long table, with their larding pins in their hands and skewers in their cap, who began to work, keeping time to the tune of a very harmonious song. The princess, all astonished at this sight, asked them who they worked for. "For Prince Riquet with the Tuft," said the chief of them, "who is to be married tomorrow." Well, the princess was more surprised than ever, and recollecting that it was now that day 12 month on which she had promised to marry Riquet with the Tuft, she was like to sink into the ground. What made her forget this was that when she made this promise, she was very silly, and having obtained that vast stock of wit which the prince had bestowed on her, she had entirely forgot her stupidity. She continued walking, but had not taken 30 steps before Riquet with the Tuft presented himself to her, bravely and most magnificently dressed, like a prince who was going to be married. "You see, madame, I am very exact in keeping my word, and doubt not in the least. But you are come hither to perform yours, and to make me, by giving me your hand, the happiest of men." I shall
freely own to you,
answered the princess,
that I have not yet taken any resolution on this affair. And I believe I never shall take such a one as you desire.
You astonish me, madame, said Riquet with the tuft.
I believe it, said the princess, and surely if I had to do with a clown or a man of no wit, I should find myself very much at a loss. A princess always observes her word, would he say to me, and you must marry me since you promised to do so. But as he whom I talk to is the man of the world who is master of the greatest sense of judgment, I'm sure he will hear reason. You know that when I was but a fool, I could, notwithstanding, never come to a resolution to marry you. Why will you have me? Now I have so much judgment as you gave me, which makes it a more difficult person than I was at the time to come in such a resolution, which I could not then determine to agree to. If you sincerely thought to make me your wife, you've been greatly in the wrong to deprive me of my dull simplicity and make me see things much more clearly than I did. Savage.
This drawing was beautiful. I almost made it the icon, but I know how YouTube works. It would have sunk the video. For those who might not be able to see it, it's a very beautifully colored group of people standing in the woods. You can see the prince dressed very elegantly and dashingly in his full outfit of sort of 17th century clothing, talking to a very large ball-gowned princess, and the servants are about. And just up in the top corner, you can make out a fairy.
If a man of no wit and sense, replied Riquet with the tuft, would be entitled, as you say, to reproach you for breach of your word, why will you not let me, madame, do likewise in a matter wherein all the happiness of my life is concerned? Is it reasonable that persons of wit and sense should be in a worse condition than those who have none? Can you pretend this, you who have so great a share, and desired so earnestly to have it? But let us come to fact, if you please. Setting aside my ugliness and deformity, is there anything in me which displeases you? Are you dissatisfied with my birth, my wits, humor, or manners?
Not at all, said the princess.
I love you and respect you in all that you mention. If it be so, said Riquet with the tuft, I am like to be happy, since it is in your power to make me the most lovable of men.
How can that be? Said the princess.
It will come about, said Riquet with the tuft, if you love me enough to wish it to be so, and that you may no ways doubt, madame, of what I say, for the same fairy who on my birthday gave me for gift the power of making the person who should please me greatly witty and judicious, has in like manner given you for gift the power of making him whom you love and would grant that favor to extremely handsome.
If it be so, said the princess, I wish with all my heart that you may be the most lovable prince in the world, and I bestow it on you as much as I am able. Well, the princess had no sooner pronounced these words, but Riquet with the tuft appeared to her the finest prince on earth, the handsomest and most amiable man she'd ever saw. Some affirm, though, that it was not the enchantments of the fairy which worked this change. In fact, some hold the fairy did nothing at all. Instead, it was love alone that caused the metamorphosis. They say that the princess, having made due reflection on the perseverance of her lover, his discretion, and all the good qualities of his mind, his wit, and judgment, saw no longer the deformity of his body, nor the ugliness of his face, that his hump seemed to her no more than the homely air of one who has a broad back, and that whereas then she saw him limp horribly, she found it nothing more than a certain sidling air, which charmed her.
They say farther that his eyes, which were very squinting, seemed to be all the more bright and sparkling, and that their irregularity passed in her judgment for a mark of a violent excess of love. And in short, that his great red nose had, in her opinion, somewhat of the martial and heroic qualities. Howsoever it was, the princess promised immediately to marry him, on condition he obtained her father's consent. And the king, being acquainted that his daughter had abundancy of esteem for Riquet with the Tuft, whom he knew otherwise from a most sage and judicious prince, received him for his son-in-law with pleasure, and the next morning their nuptials were celebrated, as Riquet with the Tuft had foreseen, and according to the orders he had a long time before given. Two things. Why does her sister get so screwed in this story? What did she ever do wrong? And I'm gonna read this is of the era where they just tell you the morals at the end of the story. I'm gonna read you Charles Perrault's assessment of the morals of this story. He gives 2. And then I want to hear people's opinions on this. What in this little tale we find is less a fable than real truth, in those we love appear rare gifts of mind and body too, with judgment, beauty, youth. I'm okay with that one. I'll talk about that one briefly. Another, a countenance whereon by nature's hand beauty is traced, also the lively stain of such complexion art that can ne'er attain. With all these gifts hath not so much command on hearts as hath one secret charm alone. Love finds that out to all besides unknown. That's just saying beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Yeah. Generis' fairies got a troll sometimes. The thing that stands out for me here is I like the actual aimed moral of the story as I understand it, which is basically in a relationship you bring out the best in each other. And I think that's neat. I haven't really seen a folk tale or a fairy tale with that kind of moral before. However, if the point of the story was supposed to be that wit is enough to get you through, I don't know that that's what this story said, because it basically just gave us an assessment of a situation where she was like, your wit's great, but your hideous face can go to hell, and just was ready to dump him. And then he was like, actually, there's a trick where I can be more palatable to you. And then the story in the end is like, actually, she just really fell in love with him then, which I don't know how much sense that makes, but it still seems to be, the point is it's still just about looks, because the sister gets screwed. She has all the wit in the world, and that the princes weren't coming around for her. And the other princess was like ready to kick him into a ditch because he wasn't good looking to her, just because he said some good things. I don't know, Mr. Perrault, that you have achieved the moral that you want to achieve. Yeah, maybe it is just fairies trolling. If I was a fairy, that's all I would do. I would just troll people. I would tell them I did stuff that I definitely didn't do, and so on. Well, that is all I wanted to read tonight. Stories of just that included just the most savage burns on babies, but in two very different directions. One just was really mean to people, and the other one seemed to imply it was of a different species. Anyhow, if you want to read either of these stories, I believe they're both available as ebooks for free on Project Gutenberg. Neither one of them is a new book. Not new in translation, not new, period. So they're out of copyright. You can get them. This one was called The Fairy Tales of Charles Perrault. Perrault is spelled Perrault, because he is French. At least I think he's French. So tell me if I'm wrong.
The other is Irish Fairy Tales by W.B. Yeats, but I think it's actually bundled into a collection called the Folklore or Folk Tales and Fairy Tales of the Irish Peasantry, I think is the name of it. I have the hard copy of it. It's one of my favorite books. Anyways, GS says, very enjoyable, Rory. Thank you. See you next week, Gennaro. Thank you very much for coming by, GS, and watching and interacting. Thank you, Gennaro, very much for coming by and adding in your thoughts. I enjoyed seeing them. GS says, I think you wrote Cinderella. That is possibly true, yes. Though, to be fair, Cinderella is one of those ones, there's like, every culture has a Cinderella. Some version of it. But I think the famous version, the one that everybody knows, that Disney took, I believe, comes from Charles Perrault, yeah. Yeah, Gennaro says, yeah, the version with the pumpkin. Okay. Well, this is the time of the show where I ramble. So I'm going to stop. Thank you so much for everybody who came and lurked. If you enjoyed any of the stories, the way you can give a little clap or a round of applause is by liking the video. No, it doesn't really help the algorithm. The algorithm doesn't like this content, and that's fine. I hope you did, though, because I don't read it for an algorithm. And I hope you have a good night, because I will keep the fire warm for you.